Okay, good morning. This is the ARC of DFW Areas Creating IEPs series. We are in week 3 of this 8-week series, so there's still several weeks to come. If you missed the first couple of weeks, if you were registered, you would have already received week 1. Week 2 went faster so that you get them before a week later, but note that you will still get the recording of them if you missed this, as long as you're still registered. So we do have 2 sponsors for this event. One is Metroport Rotary Club that specifically sponsors the Creating IEP program. Amerigroup Health Insurance is also a sponsor of all of the programs at the ARC of DFW area. So we thank them. The ARC of DFW area specifically is education and advocacy or view area. So let's get started with creating IEPs today. So I am Melissa Griffiths. Again, I am the programs director at the ARC of DFW area. I am also a local non-attorney advocate. So if you need to reach out to me, you can reach me at dfw.org, or you can just email the info, the main email, and they will forward it to me if you have questions about this program. So I didn't update this slide apparently, but creating IEPs is our creating informed and empowered parents. So we take a little bit of here at the ARC for this program. So back to our schedule of events. Again, like I said, we're on week 3, that's behavior. Next week, we'll have Jennifer Jordan come in and she's gonna be talking about assessment and our class. And then we'll go on to week 5 rather, and I think that's me back again, but I'll have to double check my schedule. Questions about any of the topics coming up, you're welcome to submit those in advance so that we can make sure that we cover those topics when we get to them. Those questions rather. Okay, today what we're talking about, we're going to start by what is behavior, what does it mean, what does it look like, then we'll assessment and a behavior intervention plan. We'll finish it up with manifest determination reviews, and then Q&As if we still haven't gotten answered all of your questions at that point. I try really hard to answer them as we go because I know things get lost if we wait. But anyway, there's time at the end. So understanding child development takes the emphasis away from the child's character, looking at the child as good or bad. The emphasis is put on behavior as communication. Discipline is thus seen as problem solving. The child is, and this is Ellen Gilinski, and she has served on boards with the Department of Education, and she looks at child psychology and the way that we communicate. So this is a focus of where I'm going to start our behavior conversation, is through that all of our behavior is communication. That's a really understand so that we can understand why behaviors are happening. So communication, defined by Merriam-Webster, is a process by which information is exchanged between individuals through a common system of symbols, signs, or behaviors. Personnel engaged in communicating, personnel engaged in transmitting or exchanging information. So communication to me is fascinating. I have been fascinated with communication, which is why it was my major in college. But since I was in high school, when I took my very first college course, and communications and interpersonal and their body language and what that means and how that interprets to understanding the messages that they're conveying. So communication happens in so many different ways, and we know that the majority of our communication happens not through words, but through our body language. And Paul, so I apologize, Paul, says that you cannot not communicate. Every behavior is a kind of communication. Because behavior does not have a counterpart, there is no anti-behavior, it is not possible to not communicate, which just goes along with what I just said. There is no way that any person at any time is not communicating. To that a little bit more, and let's think about what that looks like. But defining behavior. So we know what communicating is. It's transmitting messages. It's explaining ideas. What is behavior? The behavior is the way that someone conducts themselves. It's the way someone has an action or It's the response of an individual, group, or species to an environment. And it's the way in which something or someone functions or operates. Okay, so behavior in and of itself is just the way someone connects themselves, community needs. So when we're looking at understanding behavior as communication, we have a really good understanding if we look at infants. So when a new child is born into a family, we are often able to understand what different types of cries might mean. We're able to understand if they're wiggling a certain way, if a yawn means they might be tired, when they wake up from a nap, a different kind of cry, what their food cry sounds like, if they're whining when they haven't eaten enough, some body language, and a few sounds. Okay, and so it's really important to understand that not all of our students need to be able to use their words to be able to communicate, and that they are using behavior. When I look at behavior with adults, I know that if my husband decides to start cleaning up, that he's stressed. He didn't have to tell me when he came home from work, I had a stressful day and I'm frustrated and I just need things to be organized so I can relax. He didn't have to tell me that, because I know that his behavior is telling me he needs a picked up house. 4 kids, it's a difficult task, but we do our best. So that if they start getting more quiet or reserved, or if you hang out with a grandparent, you know, the way that they're folding their arms, the way that they're crossing their feet, you know, when your boss comes into work, you can tell whether or not they're having a good day because of behavior, not because they said it's not a good day and I'm not going to talk to you today, or I'm not going to approve your request today. So we need to remember this in children and students as well. Sometimes I think that we expect our students to be able to explain all of their feelings and explain all of their frustrations when something goes wrong. And so children still need to learn those skills as well, to be able to explain what is happening in their brain and how the environment or what is going on has affected them and what to do about it, because they don't know always what to do. And so it's kind of like an investigation. Behavior is shaped by the ability to develop a way to communicate. So behavior is shaped by our life events. The experiences that we've had, what we're exposed to as a child, the environment that we're exposed to frames our way of looking at life, and it frames our way of being able to communicate. Successes we've had using previous communication tools. So if we're looking at a toddler, let's say, whining and crying getting them attention? Is it getting them the item they desire? Is it getting them the information they desire? And an adult, it may look like acting like a victim, being loud, or always being the center of attention, because that is getting them the input that they need. So it's depending on how that was received in previous events, that may continue and be perpetuated. How much autonomy a person has received, if they've been permitted to make decisions for them, may affect their ability to have behavior. Recent changes in their life, stability, how someone was previously treated, if they feel safe. Also, to consider is trauma. We know through research disabilities have experienced trauma in their lives, even from a young age. So being sure that we are aware of that information and that we are using it to understand behavior. Okay, a lot of trauma comes, well, sometimes trauma comes from medical experiences, even in infant trauma, and we're finding out more research about those things even before birth or in birthing process, how that trauma can affect abilities to process information and to express themselves for all of us. So when do we need to worry about behaviors? We know not all behavior is fabulous. So anytime that we are getting our work done at school, it's not an issue. That's a behavior, but it's not a behavior that needs to be addressed, right? So when behavior needs to be addressed in a school setting is when it's interfering with a child's education. And this is because we don't want to have these interfering behaviors become systemic or become an issue that we have to take to a farther disciplinary action. So we want to, in the beginning, get it established that there is a behavior and what we're going to do to support and try to if we wait too long to adjust these behaviors, or we wait too long to acknowledge that the disability has an impact on behavior, then it could have more difficult consequences, and it's more difficult to adjust those behaviors the longer they go on. It doesn't talk a lot about behavior specifically, but it says that in the case of a child whose behavior impedes the child's learning or that of others, consider the use of positive behavioral interventions and supports. And now I have listed some federal regulations in these slides. Again, as I said in previous presentations, I am not an attorney, and so I cannot give you, I don't give any legal advice, but I do list these so that you can take the time, if you would like, to understand that these laws exist with them yourselves, and understand them, because as citizens, we have the ability to understand the laws that govern our land. So again, I'm not providing any opinion about how the law should be used, but rather just letting you know that the laws exist. So when we're addressing behavior in school, it needs to be addressed. So typically, this usually comes from a parent expressing a concern or a teacher expressing a concern. And this isn't a behavior that's like just bothers the teacher, but a behavior that impedes the child's learning or that of others. It's going to come from a parent who says, you know, this behavior is happening at home, or they're getting reports about a behavior. Is this something that we need to look into? Or a teacher is going to express concern about a behavior. When that happens, and it's discussed that something needs to be done about it, we need to look further into what's going on with this behavior. That is an assessment. And so that can be done with your regular assessments as you're doing an IEP, because that would be looking at all areas of disability, would be to do a functional behavioral assessment if that is a concern, or it can be done at a separate time. But anytime you do an assessment, there is parent consent. There does not need to be parental consent if information is being collected on all students in a classroom. So if the teacher is collecting who is getting all of their work done every day for every single student in the class, that is not an FBA, and that does not require parental consent. On your child and when their behavior is happening and exactly how it's happening, and keeping all of that, that is part of a functional behavioral assessment, and so you do need to give consent for that. Once it's completed, and I didn't create a slide for this, so just I'm going to spat off some of this information, then we'll move on. Behavioral assessment, we can then create a behavior intervention plan as a result. So we start with this assessment, what's going on, and we're talking about what that looks like. And then we're going to come up with a plan of what we're going to do about it. So that comes after. That's something that we can do if it's part of your IEP at your IEP meeting. It's also something you can do separate. It should be tied into your IEP. It should be, once you have it established, it should be tied into your IEP and completed at an ARD meeting. And it should be reviewed annually, at minimum, annually, unless it needs to be reviewed more frequently. Okay. So an SBA is an assessment, like I said before, and you ask for it when any kind of behavior is an issue. So if there's an issue that you believe is impeding your child's ability to access curriculum or to participate in classrooms, or is impeding to learn, you can ask for a functional behavior assessment. So many people believe that an SBA is, so we're going to say SBA, so I don't have to keep saying those words because I'm going to get tongue-tied after a while, but many believe that an SBA is an assessment that occurs when the child's behavior reaches an unmanageable proportion. This is not necessarily the case. If it has become an unmanageable proportion and we have not done an SBA or started to create a BIF, a behavior intervention plan, or a BIF yet, then for sure it needs to be considered. However, And it's not just when those behaviors have become anything that is interfering with the education of your child. This example says a child who zones out may need an FBA, even if they're not irritating the teacher, the sister. You know, I have kids at my house, and it's all about irritating sisters lately. But even if they're not irritating their teacher, child who just, you give them an assignment and they're just going to sit there. It's not bothering anyone, right? So teacher might not even notice for a while. But if this is happening regularly, we may want to get an FBA to determine why this is happening, because it's too hard. Is it happening because we don't understand and we didn't understand the instructions? Is it happening because we need some sort of other input? So there's a lot of different reasons that a behavior can happen. And if it's preventing us from learning and preventing us from moving forward, we need to take a look at it. Okay, an FBA focuses on identifying the function or the purpose behind a child's behavior. So we are trying to figure out why this behavior is looking closely at a wide range of child-specific factors. It should include both observation and formal assessments. It's generally understood to be an individualized evaluation of a child in accordance with these regulations, continues to be a child with a disability, and the nature and extent of the special education related services that a child needs, including the need for a BIP. Then this comes from an OSERS letter that I put in the resources, and you'll see that slide later. But it's important to note that if your child's behavior of their disability, we want that noted. We want it noted as soon as possible that this behavior, or that there is behavioral concerns as a result of your child's disability. And that's going to come into play later on. And it's not always something that we tend to do in younger grades, but there's a record of that. Because in the younger grades, a lot of times the behaviors that we're seeing, on the rare occasion, they are more severe and dangerous. But in the younger grades, they tend to be less severe against the code of conduct. And as they get expectations change, they can have more violations against code of conduct as a result of their disability, and we want that documented. So who should conduct an FBA? Now, IDEA doesn't have any regulations of specifically who can conduct an FBA. Behavior analyst, or at minimum, a board certified associate behavior analyst. The difference is a master's and a bachelor's degree or certificate there. So if that's not a possibility, I know we in Texas have some very, very remote areas that it may be very difficult to find one. At even the most minimum, it would need to have someone that has special training in behavior. But I would prefer, so it's done appropriately, these two here. The laws, again, there is nothing specific about who has to do an FBA, but it does say that states should adopt a policy that includes a requirement that the local education agencies take measurable steps to recruit, hire, train, and retain highly qualified personnel. So we're talking about highly qualified disabilities. So we could try to tell them, is this a highly qualified person? The state education agencies must establish and maintain qualifications necessary to carry out the purposes of IDEA, that people are appropriately and adequately prepared and trained. Highly qualified and related services personnel, such as social workers, school psychologists, behavior specialists, instructional assistants, meet state certification, licensing, or registration, or other requirements for professional discipline. So there's nothing in here, there's nothing that I have found that says an FBA must be completed by personnel. Now, just like with any other assessment, if you are not happy with your FBA, if you don't believe that it adequately portrays what is happening in the situation, you can always request an independent educational evaluation on district. That is always an option that you have with any assessment that you allow your child to have given to them. So you want to keep that in mind as well. Okay, any questions then? So I don't want to. Okay. An SBA is a systematic method of assessment for obtaining information about the purposes or the functions of a problem behavior serves for a person. Results are used to guide the design of an area and increasing the appropriate behavior. In order for an SBA to be technically adequate, it must operationally define target behaviors, describe the antecedent consequences that are hypothesized to maintain these behaviors, and under what conditions the behavior is more likely to occur. Okay, target behavior, and I can't remember if I mentioned this on another slide, so I'm going to mention it here before I forget. When we are defining a behavior and we are doing observation, that observation, I think it is on another slide, but that observation needs to be objective. So it's not, so an observation is he threw a pencil, period. He threw a pencil towards the front of the classroom. Okay, that is what happened. There's no questioning of where, what, why it happened. That's not part of the definition. So it's not Timmy threw a pencil to hit somebody else. We don't know. So we don't want in our definition of the behavior for it to include an opinion of what has happened. We need it to be very clinical in the way that this is the behavior. Sean sits down after 20 steps in the hallway and puts his head down on the desk when given a math assignment or when given an assignment. We want to be specific, but sometimes we don't know exactly if it's always math or English or what it is that may be causing it, or lose a class member at circle time. Okay, so we're not saying why. We're not saying because she is bored, because that's not part of the definition. So I just want to be very clear that we want to make sure the definitions are objective. And then we need to describe what happened before. So what was happening before this happened, before this event? So I'm gonna put my pen down. So before Sean broke his pencil in half, what happened? What was going on? Was there people talking? Was nobody talking? Was this a new assignment? Did the teacher just finish instructions? How long were those instructions? Were they doing instructions for the last half an hour and then they give a paper and then all of a sudden they break their pencil? Or did they do some instructions and then it had been 15 minutes before? Some things need to be looked at, even not immediately before, but it could have been earlier in the day. It could have been something that happened at home. Okay, so we need to know what is happening before these things to find that pattern of what's going on. And then we need to understand the consequence. Consequence is not a negative, it's just what happened as a result. Okay, so it could be that they got attention. It could be that they got kicked out of class. It could be that they were given a new assignment and a new pencil. It could be that they were redirected to do something else. Whatever the consequence of what the behavior is, then we can do a hypothesis. I say we, I mean the assessor can do a hypothesis of why this is happening, right? So why is this happening and what would be required to keep these behaviors? And then we can look at, these are the circumstances under which it is happening. And these are the things that we can start to change to make it less likely to occur or more likely to occur. It will more likely occur when we are given a problem that has a worksheet that has 100 problems on it. So all things that can be looked at when we're doing the FBA, they should be looked at. Okay, so let's talk about these different functions that different behaviors may serve. One is attention. So an example of this is someone who raises their hand every, in fact, I had a call about this, a child in kindergarten was having behavior problems because they kept raising their hand and blurting out. Well, the child wanted attention. So we don't need to put him necessarily on a behavior plan for this. We can do some. It became an issue that these positive behavior supports are not being effective and we're not able to curb this. Then we may need to look at, is it more than attention? Is it something else that this is a result of? Another option is escape. So if you are trying to escape work, is it an assignment that's too difficult? Is it that you don't want to go somewhere, right? So the function would be escaping, getting out of it. Would be wanting something. So something, you want to do something, you want to have something, you want to hold something. Again, it says Michelle takes an iPad away from Erin, so Erin pinches her. If pinching gets access to the iPad, then he's going to keep pinching her because, hey, when I look at my own kids, my youngest child will just start screaming because he knows that I can't handle the screaming, and he has 3 older siblings that will come to the rescue and try to figure out why the screaming is happening. So if we continue to respond every time he screams, he's going to keep screaming because it's getting a response he wants, or the iPad that he wants, or whatever. As long as he's still getting that, when he does a behavior, it's going to continue. Another function is sensory, and these are automatic sometimes. So I sit in my chair and I move, right? So some sensory input to settle me, or in this example is twirling hair. Okay, so I'm getting some sensory input from doing this. It may be some children hit, or they might yell, or different things to have. Okay, FBA methods can be classified into 3 types. So there's 3 ways that we're going to look at these. Functional or experimental analysis, descriptive. So functional analysis or experimental analysis can be a little bit tricky in that you are manipulating the environment to make a behavior happen. So if we're doing an FBA, and let's say that once a month, hides under her desk, or once a month, Judy bolts from the classroom. It can be difficult to do an assessment in hopes that you're going to catch that once a month. Now, that is a behavior that may be impeding her ability to learn, but we need to see if we can figure out not happening on a daily basis or a weekly basis. It can be difficult to observe that and to use other methods to understand what's happening. So if we have some idea of what is happening, we can use functional analysis to try and see if this behavior occurs when we set up the environment in a specific way. And it does need to be done in inflicting what could be a negative or feelings and emotions to come from a child. Descriptive assessment involves observation of the problem behavior in relation to the events that are not arranged in a systemic manner. So this is a really important part of an FBA, because we need to know what's happening. And sometimes teachers on their own, they can't see everything that's happening. They can't. There's just too much for them to manage. They're managing several children at a time. They might see the consequence of problem behavior, but they may not see what has caused it, what the antecedents were. And so observations need to be done over a variety of settings and over a variety of periods, especially if this is a pervasive behavior, something that is affecting education on a daily. Then if it is affecting them in multiple settings, then multiple settings need to be observed, okay? And multiple days. So they're easier to conduct in a functional analysis because you're not manipulating the environment. And though the bias, they can sometimes include opinion. So we got to watch to make sure that they're not opinionated. Indirect functional assessments might use interviews, rating scales, questionnaires. This is all some other information that we might do some information gathering, okay? They're also easier to conduct than don't have to have necessarily the child to be a part of. We can get it from other sources because they are other people's accounts or knowledge of what the behavior is. They can be unreliable. So it's important to make sure that we're getting here. Only one of these ways is not going to be sufficient. Just doing interviews of a teacher without observation is not going to be sufficient, okay? Because that's just giving an opinion of what that teacher saw. And like we just said, there's not a way for the teacher to see everything. So the basic strategy for conduct and descriptive assessment. So we're gonna gather that information. We're gonna interpret the information from those assessments and formulate hypotheses around the purpose of the problem. We're gonna test these hypotheses. So we can try and do a functional analysis if it's not going to cause harm to the child. Might happen so that we can see, oh, this is actually when it happens. And look, I can manipulate the environment. I can manipulate the situation to show that this will happen. Then we would develop intervention options based on the function of the problem behavior. So an FBA should include intervention options. It should say, often intervention consists of selecting a replacement behavior that serves the same function as the problem behavior. So this little bit at the bottom is actually incredibly important. Any behavior that we are trying to change, that we are trying to make it, needs to serve the same purpose, okay? So as we develop a behavior intervention plan, if we're looking at a behavior that is avoidance, okay, and we try to replace that avoidance behavior with attention, it's not gonna work. We need a technique for an avoidance function. Does that make sense? So if we'll give an example of writing. Okay, so writing is overwhelming. It's really hard. I can't do it. I get frustrated every time it happens. I scratch out my paper. I might break a pencil. I might rip up. So if I am getting, instead of a support on not having to do it, avoiding that work, if I'm going to get something that just says, you can do it, you're amazing, it's not going to help because I don't want to do it. And in the beginning, I need to not do it, but I need a better way of doing it. It may be I am going to take a walk around, the classroom, and then I'm going to sit down and do it. I still get to avoid it. I don't have to not do it at all, but I get to have a behavior that allows me to avoid it for a minute. Okay. Same for attention. So if that gives me attention, then instead, can someone sit next to me and give me attention? Can a teacher praise me? Do I want someone to praise me? Then is that going to happen instead of me having to act out in class? Does that all make sense? Hopefully what I'm saying makes sense. The ways that things that could be included in your FBA, there are 14 listed here. They do not all need to be in your FBA because not every assessment is going to be the same. These are different strategies that can be used to do the assessment, but not be appropriate. Okay, so again, a description of the target behavior needs to be objective. As I talked about earlier, that does need to be there. We do need to review records, but there are different checklists that can be used related to circumstances that surround a behavior. We may want to do student interviews where that's possible if the student may be able to understand why they're having behaviors, or I have a child that's very young who's very much able to understand herself. She's very self-aware. So she may do better with an interview. Interview of other people, other staff. It could be interviews with parents. It could be interviews. See that from a school FBA. We need to see direct observations in a natural setting without manipulations. We want to describe how the data will be collected, including number of days, periods, or instances of behavior. So I saw an FBA the other day that was like every afternoon they came and did an observation of this child. Every single day. It was multiple days, but it was always at the same time. And so I felt like that's not really able to see what's happening before. You're only able to see afternoon after lunch. So we need to know what's happening if this is occurring at different times during the day. How can we understand the antecedents if we're only looking at the same time every day? Okay. Now, unless there is a circumstance that it is, we still need to observe what is happening at other times of the day so that we can understand why it may be happening at that time of day. So I keep looking at my door to see if my kids are coming in. Okay. And we need to review where out of their classroom to see them do a math assignment. If they normally do their math assignment in the classroom. That doesn't make any sense. If they're having a concern while they're in a special education classroom, apart from a general education classroom, then we're not going to observe them in a general education classroom to at least include that regular classroom that they are in which they would normally learn. We can use scatter plots. We can use the ABCs, which is the antecedent, behavior, and consequences analysis. We can use functional analysis, observation forms, and those are the people forcers. What is keeping this going? Ecological context, which is environment, and then development of a hypothesis statement and a functional analysis. So professional judgment would determine which components should be used in which particular place. So you may not use scatter plots and a all-in-one FBA. It may be appropriate, it may not, but these are just some of the things that can be used, and I just wanted to put those there for you. Okay, that's everything I have about FBA. We're going to move on to behavior intervention plan. So I'm going to pause for a minute and I'm going to check and see specifically that I did not cover. So I see Monica put on a comment that all of her antecedents were written or at circle time and there was no detail or on any context. So you may want to ask, was it a transition, you know, what happened before the transition time? It could, because an antecedent could be not the transition, but it could be what was happening before the transition or where they are going to, happening at circle time rather than just that it's circle time. So what was happening at circle time? We're reading a book, we're watching a movie, we're doing a dance party, you know, tons of things happen at circle time. We're going over the weather. So what was happening at that circle time? And then also at transition, is it transition to PE? Is it transition to their subject? Okay, so what is that going to look like? I'm going to give a few more examples when we get into behavior intervention plan. But I will yeah, so you just need who is the person? Are they qualified to provide that assessment? And then also ask for more detail on what they're doing, because that doesn't give you enough information to make a plan off of changing, to change behavior if all we know, understand how that supports just saying transition of what, transition how, and circle time is generally 20 minutes long. And is it happening in the beginning of circle time, the middle of circle time, the end of circle time? Is it when we're starting to read a book? Is it the middle of reading a book? Is it the end of reading a book? Is it because I sat next to this child? Who was I sitting next to in that circle time? All of those, and FBA focuses on identifying the function or the purpose behind the child's behavior. Typically, the process involves looking closely at a wide range of specific factors. Knowing why the child misbehaves is directly helpful to the IEP team in developing a BIP or behavior intervention plan that will reduce or eliminate this behavior. Okay, teaches and rewards good behavior. It can be a single page or it can be many pages. The purpose is to prevent or stop a misbehavior, not to punish the child. I should just say not just, it should just say not to punish the child. The plan has 3 parts. And we get a lot of this from the assessments, from the observations. That's why the FBA is important before we develop a behavior intervention plan. It describes what is happening. What is happening? Where is this happening? It puts strategies in place for support. So a properly done FBA will behavior intervention plan. An improperly done FBA will not provide us the information we need to be able to move forward to change misbehavior into acceptable behavior. Okay, it's really important that we fully understand the function and the consequence of the why it's happening, which is the antecedent. So it's really important that we understand those steps so that we can create this proper plan. So a positive behavior intervention plan targets behaviors. A good plan should concentrate on a limited number of target behaviors. 2, max 3 behavior. Look, my kids have a lot of behavior issues in my house. If I try to solve them all at once, first of all, I'm going to be exhausted. Second of all, new behaviors are going to come up because I'm trying to solve so many other behaviors. And third, I'm going to get tired and not be able to it's too much to track. It's too much to change. It's too much for a child. So we need to look at 1, 2, 3 max. I would say 2 to change at a time. We can't change the world all at once. We take 1 step at a time. So the target behavior should be defined, recognizing it. So because the behavior intervention plan goes along with our IEP, everyone who teaches the child has an IEP. Everyone who needs to have knowledge of the IEP would have that. But a behavior intervention plan needs to have with everyone who comes in contact with that child. So if this behavior comes up with one of those people, they need to be able to recognize that behavior. So it's important to collect the data on the antecedents, the frequency, the severity, and the duration of the behaviors, as well as the intervention used. First, a baseline of the behavior must be defined, and then continual data must be kept in order to measure progress. We've gotten all of this lovely FBA data. We're going to say, okay, this is what's happening. This is why it's happening. And then we have to keep tracking it to see, is it still happening? How often is it still happening, etc. We're going to look at replacement behaviors. Instead of concentrating attention on the objectionable, socially preferable, positive replacement behaviors. So we are not going to just find ways to make them stop doing what they're doing. We are going to teach appropriate positive behavior. That is important. We can't just stop a behavior. We need to teach a new behavior. So if we're trying to communicate something, you can't just put, now you can't communicate that anymore. It's just going to pop up somewhere else. I'm going to try to communicate it in a different way. Okay, so we have to give new communication methods. We have to give new behavior that is going to allow us to still express in a more acceptable way. So it says, for example, the child might be taught to take a break from a stressful, frustrating task rather than act out aggressively. So those are still ways to get out of an activity. It's frustrating, so I'm going to go to another classroom or to the principal's office, or I may be able to get out of my work some other way, or the paper's taken away from me. But instead, we're going to teach them to be able to take a break, and that may come from using a card. It may come from, if they're able to use words, using language. So we need to find those new behaviors to replace it with. Okay, positive reinforcers. The plan must identify reinforcers which can be used to positively reinforce appropriate socially accessible behavior. So how are we going to keep that going? What's going to reinforce that? And then the plan will provide for. We need to know how often this is happening, what we're doing. Is there a schedule that we're going to put in place? Needs to be a schedule that we're going to put in place to reinforce these positive behaviors. Prevention of a target behavior. Some plan must be made in addition to encouraging a replacement behavior to prevent the target manipulation or change of the antecedents, presentation of choices, teaching, demand, fading, etc. So there's lots of these options that you can use to change behavior or to prevent behavior. It may mean that we need to change the classroom. Guess what? A whole classroom can be changed because one child needs a behavior change if possible. It may need to be a change in the way the teacher is teaching. Okay, so is the teacher using a teaching method that is not working for this child? We may need to look at if a different method will still be effective to teach the rest of the day. We may need to start with allowing for a 5-minute break and then shorting it to a 3-minute break and then a 2-minute break and then a 1-minute break and then no breaks, and then we don't have this issue anymore. So that's fading. So there are a lot of different ways that we can prevent a plan on how to react to an occurrence of the behavior. So when this is happening, what are we going to do? It could include a redirection to the appropriate replacement behavior. It could include ignoring, or it could include consequences. So if this behavior starts coming up, what is the plan? There's like emergency action, change the behavior. It's not going to be perfect. Nobody is perfect. So what do we do when it pops up? How are we going to respond to that? Everyone needs to know how to do it, and they need to do it the same. Okay? Evaluative process. There must be some way to measure the success of the plan. This should involve goals. So much talking. So we need to be able to measure, okay, this is where we started. That's why we have that baseline data. This is where we started. We're 1 month in. Now this is how many times it's happening. 2 weeks even, depending on what the behavior is and how quickly we think we can. Now we're down to, we could only set a circle time for 3 minutes. Now we're up to 3.5 minutes. That is success. That is progress. Okay. Now, where do we plan to be? How long do we think it will take them to get to 5 minutes? What about 20 minutes? Okay. And so is that a goal that we have? Is that necessary? Or do we think that 5 minutes is sufficient? Do we think, what are the milestones? Just like with any other goal that we do in an IEP, we need to have those milestones and we need to be able to measure it. Okay, so components of a function-based IEP. We need to have timely information. We're going to do that hypothesis. We're going to do a strategy for intervention, antecedents, events, and context. We're going to teach and use. We're going to have a reinforcer of that replacement behavior when that replacement behavior is used. How we're going to keep reinforcing it. Are we going to give them a sticker? Are we going to give them iPad time? Are we going to say high five, good job, etc. The consequence, what they're getting out of it, what are we going to do about it, monitoring the progress, and then starting over. So we just keep going that circle over and over and over again until that behavior is adjusted to the goal that we have set. Okay, so problem behavior. So these are just components of your behavior intervention plan and what you should see. So a problem behavior, observable and measurable, predictors, antecedents, environmental issues are logical, related to the problem behavior, and specific, not just work or reading class. Okay, so I want to give you an example of a student. There was a frequent issue with the student's behavior. What the teacher saw was work that had not been done on a computer and the computer being slammed shut, which resulted in a computer being taken away and a worksheet being ripped up and a pencil being broken, which then resulted in hiding under a table. Okay, this was the situation. So is it logical to understand this did not happen regularly? This was occasionally things like this would happen. So logically, we're not saying every time it's, that's not the case. So we need to understand what the predictors or what the antecedents were. In this case, antecedents were, there was a child sitting next to this child who was saying things that made them feel frustrated and uncomfortable. They understood. So they laid on the floor to do avoidance of the work. Laying on the floor enticed additional information from the child sitting next to them and the teasing. That increased the problem to slamming down the computer, got it taken away, which then presented even more difficult task of having to do the same assignment on paper when we didn't understand the assignment in the first place. Okay, and it just went from there. So it's really important that we look at the entire picture, because what it looks, not for their own fault, is that the student refuses to do work and that they are going to get out of it and not use school equipment appropriately. That's what a teacher would say when they called. Your student did not use school equipment appropriately. They didn't want to do their assignment. The function of that behavior was avoidance of work and avoidance of a circumstance, right, of a person, which resulted in hiding under a table, because then we didn't feel safe. The teachers weren't helping us. The students weren't helping us, okay? So these are things that we have to look at. And so when I look at a behavior intervention plan, I want to know what is happening, what happened before, what happened after, and why this is happening. Okay, hold on. I gotta move this out of the way. Okay. We're gonna get there. We're gonna get to manifest determination. Okay, but replacement behavior is directly linked to the function of the challenging behavior. So the replacement behavior, and that in this case, this student needs to be taught how to say, I need help. Now, this was difficult for this student because of previous experience of not being helped when they asked, or feeling as though they were not important enough to get the help, right? Teachers say, it's not question time, it's work time. If I have a question and I don't know how to do the work, I need to ask you a question, but you have just told me now that I can't ask questions and I have to figure it out on my own, okay? So we need to make sure that the replacement behavior will actually help. So to get to the point that we need to be able to raise a hand, replacement behavior may need to be that a teacher actually comes in, or can I make sure that you understand, so that they can have a conversation first before they're ready to request support. That would be a teaching strategy. Okay, so reactive strategies describe strategies to prompt a student to which the replacement behavior for the reveal. In that scenario where someone was hiding under a table, what are we going to do about that? Because now it's escalated from just work avoidance to disrupting the entire class and not paying attention to anyone. So what are we going to do in this case? In this case, it was we needed to not ask the child to come out from that table, because that is where they were stable talking to them. Now that's where teacher training comes in. A little bit of trauma-informed care comes in, because at that point we were experiencing something that we felt so severe about that we needed to hide and run and feel safe. But there may be other strategies that can be used. A child who sits down in the middle of the floor, do we need to become this game and they're getting attention for sitting on the floor? And so maybe avoiding that behavior and ignoring it may help to lessen that behavior going forward. So the goals and objectives, they are the decrease in the challenging behavior. It needs to have dates of expected change, how long it's going to take for us to get to that. And these are not always, we're not always able to know exactly when it's going to happen. We can put in guesses of what's typically worked in these types of scenarios, but every child is frequently. But how often the data will be analyzed and who is responsible for collecting and analyzing that data. All of the people who have any of the components of the BIP and any of the skills for the training need to be a part of the team. And we need to make sure that communication is key. So that's something that each parent can decide on their own how often they want to have that communication. It needs to be happening because a parent is a part of that team, is someone that's going to help create that intervention plan, because if students can't generalize these skills to their home as well, it's going to be a lot more difficult to change. It's going to take a lot longer. So parents need to be on board with these behavior intervention plans, and they need to be communicated with. So some parents prefer to say, I want to know every single time this behavior is happening. Other parents may say, you know, I don't need to know every time. Can you let me know once a while if it goes beyond this level? because some parents just don't need to know everything, but some parents really want to. So that's a communication that needs to be discussed when you develop the plan. Okay, we are going to link the BIP to make sure that it's all tied into our IEP, that it's all in there, that again, we're showing that behavior is in there. Make sure that there is a measurement and progress system, so the effectiveness of the plan can be evaluated. So again, we're going back to making sure that we have the evaluated as we move forward. Other things to consider as you're creating the plan for the student, right? Are there training that needs to increase? Is there changes that need to be made to the classroom or other environment to reduce the likelihood of the challenging behavior? And that may need to happen at first, and then we slowly these new skills, or maybe it needs to always be changed. It depends on the situation. Providing choice, a change of setting or of activity, offering meaningful curriculum, and providing a routine. I'm not sure what the other half of that parentheses. Strategies to replace the problem behavior that serve the same function as the challenging behavior. These are all things that we've talked about. Behavior and teaching self-management or relaxation skills. Okay, that is the end. Whew, we're doing good. We got a half hour left and we got one more topic. So there's a good question here. It says, if the BIP or the IEP isn't being followed and problem behaviors occur, the child is suspended. So I would bring up to your school, the behavior intervention plan isn't being followed appropriately, that suspension is not appropriate. Now, because they didn't do what they were needing to do, and it is a legally binding agreement. If your BIP is scary, okay, nothing should be frightening or cause behaviors to increase. If that is happening and is not an appropriately written behavior intervention plan, and you absolutely can call a meeting and ask for it to be revised. We should not be increasing behaviors as a result of our behavior intervention plan. That may mean that either the antecedents are not understood, that we are trying to replace a behavior without the same function, but with a different function. Does that make sense? So we want to make sure that we're not just forcing someone to stop, but instead that we're giving them the same function, the same information, the same. But you absolutely can call the school, call an ARD, because it should be tied to your IEP, and review. Again, look at the last time your FBA was completed. Do you need a new FBA completed, or do you need an outside evaluation? Because if you've only had one, you can still ask for an IEE. As long as 3 years down the road, I probably wouldn't then ask for an IEE. But if it was in the last year or so, I would ask for an IEE. And if you don't feel like theirs is appropriate, it doesn't fully capture the situation, I would not continue a behavior intervention plan that is scaring a child and causing additional harm and trauma. That's my personal opinion. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, please ask another one. Okay. Manifestation, determination, review. Okay, so this happens when suspension happens. So let's talk about suspension. Suspension is a temporary cessation of educational services. State statutes regulate the length of a suspension. Reasons of a suspension may be ordered and the procedure which must be followed. So we can look at, generally your handbook tells you, depending on why the child is being suspended, there are different rules and regulations. And I didn't put those in here for you because there's it's a variety of different reasons, depending on what the situation is. And but sometimes for some occurrences, it's 3 days, and you can often do up to 10 days, okay, for a suspension. Are required to be given prior to suspension, the reasons of the suspension and an opportunity to explain the situation. So they can't just be suspended, you're gone. It needs to be, I need to be given, now that could be the day before, it's still prior information, but they need to be given an opportunity to share their side of the story. You need, as a parent, to be given proper notice, or parent or guardian, you need to be given notice that this is happening, and you have a right to appeal that suspension and expunge the record if the suspension is found improper. That is all students. That is going to be found in your handbooks about discipline. So how long? So your student broke a code of conduct. They get to be suspended. They do, because they need to know that the code of conduct, they have to follow code of conduct. When the suspension of a child with disabilities does become a violation of the child's right to faith, so free appropriate public education that we talked about in the purposes of IDEA last week. The rule of thumb is that when the number of days of suspension reaches 10 days, then the courts will consider this a change of placement. So we're talking about 10 consecutive days. Systemic suspension that adds to more than 10 days. So this varies depending on where you're going to go if you file due process. But in some cases, they may consider over. You need to really look at the purposes of suspension and then to figure out if that is a change of placement. So this is the federal regulation code for change of placement. And I put this in here again so that you can know that there is this code to look at. The removal of a child with a disability from the child's current educational placement. The removal is for more than 10 consecutive school days or has been subjected to a series of removals that constitute a pattern. So you need to see if there is a pattern, if there's a regular pattern that adds up to more than 10 days, that may be considered a change. The child's behavior is substantially similar to the child's behavior in previous incidents that result in the series of removals, or because of such additional factors as such as the length of each removal, the total amount of time the child has been removed, and the proximity of the removals to one another. So if he's removed 3 days at the beginning of the year and 7 days at the end of the year, it may not, and what the purpose is and how long, because there's been that big gap in between, so that would be difficult to show a series of removals that would have correlation. Does that make sense? Let me check this question real quick. No, as far as suspension, that can often happen the same day. You just need to be notified, and then you need to be able, they just have to be able to do it verbally, tell you about the suspension. If they're calling you to tell you about it, then you have the opportunity there to express your side of the story or have your student do it. You can also request to come in and have a meeting, but it's not going to stop that in-school suspension same day. Review must be made within 10 school days of any decision to make a disciplinary change of placement. So change of placement, like we talked about, could be a regular change in placement for disciplinary actions, or it could be the series of. Also, sorry, one more thing to know about in-school suspensions is that sometimes if the student is still receiving their special education services in the in-school suspension, it may not be counted against that 10 days. Schools are getting a little bit tricky, and so you have to watch where the in-school suspension teacher is a certified special education teacher. I'm seeing that more in more districts where they're, especially where they're putting students that have behavior issues in-school suspension, but because they're in-school suspension teacher, the teacher that handles, they're not counting it against their days because they're still receiving all of their services. So you want to just understand how they're doing that. Okay. Okay, so if you have a disciplinary, then you have to do this manifest determination, and it has to be within 10 school days. So this happens quick. So within 2 weeks, we're having a meeting to discuss if this is change of placement and what the appropriate things are to do. So we need to be aware that when we get to that number, so if we're creeping up to suspensions close to 10, we need to be aware. If I'm skipping something here. So at a manifest determination review, the purpose is to determine if the behavior is a manifestation of the disability. You come together with a meeting and discuss their disability, which is why I mentioned before that if there are any behaviors associated with this child's disability that have come up, we want those listed in the beginning. There's a spot on the IEP form that typically says other things that are impacted by the child's disability. We want to put what behaviors might be behaviors may have already been noted as to affect this child as a result of their disability. So that's kind of why I pushed that in the beginning. But if they decide, okay, this behavior is a manifestation because we've looked through the documentation, we've reviewed all of the previous reviews, we've had note that this is an ongoing issue, we have not been completed with fidelity, then we need to conduct an FBA. Okay, so we'll go back to that FBA process. A whole FBA needs to be completed. If we already have a behavior intervention plan in place and the FBA is not needed because we recently had one, create one if it's not in place, or we need to review the one that is in place because it is not working. Okay, so we may need to review that behavior intervention plan and say, okay, why is it not working? Is it because it's not being completed with fidelity? Is it because we have the wrong interventions in place? Is it because the settings are not being changed appropriately? Is it because we don't do additional assessments and observations? So we really need to have a conversation about why is this happening. The student, if it is a manifestation of their behavior, the student then is returned to their previous placement and the new behavior intervention plan is implemented. So instead of put back to their previous placement if it is a manifestation. Okay, if it is determined that the behavior is not a manifestation of their disability, for instance, an easy one, it would be a learning disability. Let's say a student with dyslexia who aren't mentioned ever punches someone in the face, right? Nothing that has to do with their dyslexia, unless it had to do with reading. I mean, that would be a rare reading or writing. That would be a rare circumstance. But unless it has directly to do with their disability, okay. So it's particularly difficult when we're looking at learning disabilities with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We have frequently seen or often see behavior as a component of that earlier on. So hopefully that can be noted of how that's being, that documentation of that there was a behavior. So if it is not a manifestation of their disability, then all of the regular disciplinary procedures apply. So that can include being placed at a disciplinary school if it's severe, and we'll get into that next. It can include out of school suspension, in school suspension. Anything that would apply to any other student would then apply because the disability is not in play there. However, if that is the case, the services still must be provided to the student. So the student still needs to make progress on that. They still need to have all of the services provided on their IEP provided to them in whatever placement they are put in as a result. And we need to look at, if there is no FBA or behavior intervention plan, do we need to make one of those? Well, obviously this behavior was severe enough to cause a series of events. So do we need to go back and do an FBA now to understand why this is happening so that we can make some adjustments moving forward? Okay, so if your child carries a weapon to school or possesses a weapon at school, on school premises, or at a school function, they can absolutely 100% be immediately removed. If your child knowingly possesses or uses illegal drugs or sells or solicits the sale of a controlled substance while at school on the school premises, automatically can be removed. And if your child has inflicted serious bodily injury upon another person while at school, then they can be removed for up to 45 days. These are special circumstances in which the safety of the students at the school and the safety of the school is put above the the disability right. It can still result in a 45-day removal. Now, also need to note, if this happens after the child is 18, there are additional consequences with that. And actually, once they turn 10, a lot of the consequences increase as far as legality is concerned. So we need to be aware when they're turning 10 that there will be more strict consequences put in place for these special circumstances than if they were younger than that, because by 10, those issues are expected to be understood. For your MDR. So when you're going through your MDR, it's important to know when is it. That's like first step, because remember, it's within 10 days that it has to be happening. It can happen before 10 days, but it needs to happen within 10 days. You want to make sure that you ask for the data of every school fills out an incident report for when things happen. And so you can ask for that. You want to see everything that the school is reporting so that you can be on the same page and understand what they're reporting when you walk into that meeting. You want to look at your IEP, and you want to review all of your previous paperwork to show disability eligibility. So you want to look at, like we talked about, these are the disabilities. You're going to look at your PLAS to say, here we've seen in our present levels of academic and functional performance where this has been an issue. This is not something that is just random, that it is connected to the disability. Okay, so that's how you're going to be able to do that. And then you're going to need to be able to discuss disability. And having all of those documents in place helps to prepare you to essentially state your claim that this was a manifestation of their disability, if that's the case. Okay, so here's all of the references of the things that I used in class today. And then I'll ask for your other questions. We've got a little bit longer. So these three are just challenging behaviors at home. These are for younger children. If there's books that, they're little books that you can go through to discuss behaviors and what's appropriate behaviors. I've included this slide, which is, it is a behavior support parent checklist. So is the approach individualized and positive? Was team planning used? And who was included in the team? Was a comprehensive functional behavioral assessment conducted to make sure that your FBA was conducted appropriately, comprehensively? Was a comprehensive behavior support plan developed? So there's just a checklist that for that. It kind of goes over a lot of the things that we talked about, but it just makes it in a checklist so it's easy for you. Is the plan being monitored and evaluated? And are they continuing to occur? So again, that goes over a lot of the things that we already discussed, but it's in a nice checklist form so that you can kind of go through and say, oh, I'm missing this. Is this something that I need to do, instead of having, and that is it. Okay, so what questions? We've got a few more minutes here. If you have additional, oh, there's a question here. Oh yeah, I think I answered it. Let me read it again though. Okay, so the question had to do with in-school suspension. I answered that a little bit before. If it's not a manifestation determination review, if it's not been the 10 days, then they can still do the suspension. Okay, because they're still held to appropriate behavior. 10 days, and you're trying to show several connections of these in-school suspensions, then that's something that you'll want to keep track of. When it comes to the transition and identifying transitions as an issue, then I would go back to your FBA and I would say, is it an issue because we're changing places? Is it an issue because of the way we have to walk? Is it an issue because I don't want to leave the activity that I'm doing? Do I need additional supports for someone to say we're going to be changing activities in 10 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever? Do I need a printout of my schedule or a picture schedule to show that we're going to move what that is needs to be supported better in your BIP. It sounds like you need to review your BIP again and start making some changes to make sure that your child is being supported in place so that replacement behaviors can be learned, and so, or perhaps environmental changes need to happen so that the behaviors can decrease. It is really important to me as a person to make sure kids feel safe at school. And so anytime a child does not feel safe at school, external circumstances that we cannot control of people coming into our school, but when they are with teachers and they are staff, they need to feel safe. And so they need to feel that they are someone that there's going to help them and that they have the ability to ask for help if they don't understand or if they need support in doing something. And so if that is not the feeling that your child has at their school, feeling, because it is important for every child, especially it's in the state law that we want our children to be to be prepared for education, further education, employment, independent living skills. And if we haven't taught them how to ask for help, and if we haven't taught them that there are places that they can get help and that they will be supported in the community, then they will not be supported family, to take those things into account and really have those discussions with staff and schools. Okay, any other questions? I know I have filled your head with so many words, but I am not seeing anything else. And we are at our 11:30 mark, which is how long this meeting was supposed to be. So if you do have any questions that you come up with afterwards, please feel free to email me at programs@thearcofgmc.org. And I will be happy to respond to those. Or you can find us on Facebook at the ARC of DSW area. All right, I hope you guys have a great